So, very good afternoon, dear students. Back again with this particular topic on tariff and non-tariff barriers. We've seen the role of tariff and non-tariff barriers during the course of our earlier lectures in international business. And international business in itself, with specific import and export duties, is not possible without bringing in reference to tariff and non-tariff barriers, because that's the way the world functions, where we have to keep in mind the interests of our country and also be able to deal with other countries in terms of our import and export activity in international business. So in this particular lecture specifically, we're going to talk about the role of tariff and non-tariff barriers. What are the different types of tariffs and non-tariffs, and then the kind of specific role that each of these play, and then how a particular country is able to gain from imposition of these restrictions as such. So let's look at all of this in further detail. Right, so tariff, as we understand, is nothing but a tax or a duty that is imposed on goods that are imported as well as exported. And non-tariff barriers are non-duty or non-tax restrictions by which we are trying to restrict the flow of goods coming into our country. So these are restrictions imposed on the movement of goods between countries. So it can be levied, as I said, on both imports and exports. So what are the specific reasons why a particular country would want to impose tariff and non-tariff barriers? And let's look at those reasons. The first important reason is for national security. Countries enforce tariff and non-tariff barriers to protect the borders and also to secure their nations from other countries that they think are enemy countries, or those countries with which our country does not have a friendly or a very cordial relationship. So we try to restrict so that the other country does not have access to goods of our country, and we do not have any sort of dealings with them. So that's one reason that we try to impose, whereby by imposing higher tariffs and by imposing higher barriers, we are indirectly telling those countries that we would not want to do business with you. Secondly, it can be done as an act of retaliation, because once we get into this whole aspect of import and export, there's one country that imports and another country exports. So when one country starts imposing higher tariff on the goods that are coming into their country, then automatically the other country does not like the imposition of a higher tariff. So hence they would want to retaliate on the goods that are going out from our country. So that could be a case of a tit for tat kind of a situations, and so you impose tariffs on goods that are coming out of my country, so hence I will do that, vice versa. So that's a good example of our trade war that took place the last 1 year. We witnessed the trade war between US and China, when US arbitrarily introduced higher tariffs on goods that were going from China, and in retaliation China did the same thing for goods that were coming from the US into their country. So both the governments were on a very retaliatory mode, and each were trying to enforce their power and authority, using the import and the export between those two countries. The third reason why a government would want to impose tariff and non-tariff is basically to protect jobs. As we've seen, this is through a policy called Protectionist Policy, whereby when a government imposes a tariff on goods that are coming from another country, right? So this is basically to ensure that the domestic industry and the domestic business does not suffer from businesses that come from outside, or goods that get imported into the country. So what happens if these tariffs are not there? So when these tariffs are not imposed, the goods that are imported from another country would be a lot more cheaper than the goods that are manufactured within the country. So in that case, companies and customers within the country would prefer to buy an imported good because it's a lot more cheaper. And so once that starts happening, in the long run, your domestic industry and business is going to suffer, and that automatically will lead to a loss in jobs. Fourthly, if if within a country we have a lot of industries and businesses which are in their nascent stage, which are in their stage of infancy, and they've just been started, and they need a lot of help and support and assistance for them to be able to independently run until the time that they are ready to compete with foreign companies and have goods that are alternatives for the goods that are imported within the country. So in that until that particular case, it's the responsibility of the government to make sure that they safeguard and they protect, and that's where a protectionist policy is wound to make sure that these category of goods in which the infant industries are doing business in, so those goods will not be imported, and if at all they're imported, there will be a higher import tariff that will be imposed on them. And fifthly, to protect customers, the government may levy a heavy tax on goods which are against the welfare of the country and its citizens. If, for example, a lot of goods that are very dangerous, a lot of goods that are very spurious, a lot of goods that could harm people, now that's where the government could impose a higher restriction. For example, it could be on import of foreign liquor, right? So the government could impose a higher taxation on foreign liquor or on imported cigarettes that could come into the country. So this is basically to restrict so that the consumption of these goods do not endanger the life of the citizens of a particular country. So there could be many category of goods like that, which the government may categorize and decide as to what comes into that specific list. So let's look at the various types of tariffs. So tariff, as I said, is a custom duty or a tax that is imposed on products or goods that move across borders. So the word tariff or customs or duty are interchangeably used. It is the most common instrument used for controlling imports and exports. So that's the way by which the government plays around by restricting or allowing. So the most popular kind of tax that we impose is the import tariff. So it is a custom duty imposed by an importing country. So whenever a particular country feels that any good that is being imported needs to be taxed, so they impose a taxation on that. So only by paying that requisite tax can a good come into the country. So it is levied to raise revenue and to protect the domestic country. So there are twin benefits to it. One is by imposing a tariff on imported goods, the government holds a good chance of earning good revenue. That's on one side. On the second side, by ensuring that there is a import duty, that a tariff being imposed on imported goods, it automatically is going to restrict the import of goods coming into the country, because customers and companies may not prefer to import these goods because it's very expensive, because they would have to pay a higher tariff to get these goods. So in that particular case, they might have to rely on domestic industries and domestic businesses, and that's where the domestic industry could gain out of it. Secondly, we also impose something called an export tariff. It is a duty imposed on goods by the exporting country on its own exports. So this is possible in a case where when you look at production and consumption or demand and supply equations within the country, let's say, for example, when there is a certain good that is very highly demanded within the country, in that particular case, if the government or if those companies decide to export it to outside, instead of making it available to customers within the country, they prefer to export it outside. So in that case, the government plays its role by trying to restrict those imports, restrict those goods from going out of the country. So that's where they impose an export restriction. So once an export tariff is imposed, so automatically it discourages companies from exporting, is because they will have to bear up the cost of a very high export tariff, and thereby make sure those goods do not leave the country and they'll be available for domestic consumption. Thirdly, there is a transit duty. It is levied on commodities that originate in one country and goes to another country, but while it goes, it travels to travels in between another country. So that's when a particular good, if it moves from one country to another country, and when it moves, it passes to through one or two countries. So that's where certain countries which are in between, where these goods are moving, could impose a tax called a transit duty. So these are levied, and this is another source of revenue for those countries which are in between, which really are not the importing country or the exporting country, but tend to gain the benefit because of the movement of these goods traveling across its borders. So what are the other kinds of tariff barriers that we impose? Yes, The different types of tariffs, we have something called a specific duty, specific tariff. It is for specific category of goods, and it's a fixed amount, a fixed duty that is levied upon certain commodities. This could be calculated on the basis of the weight of the commodity. So the moment it is say 1 ton of good, so automatically this is the rate at which it will be, or it could be on the basis of volume. So it's a fixed duty that is levied, a fixed rate that is charged on a fixed sort of a measurement. So that's a specific duty. Ad valorem duty or tariff is on the basis of the value of a good. It's not on the basis of the weight, but on the value of a good. Let's say, for example, if you're going to be uh, importing precious gems from a certain country, so it could just be a few handful of gems, which may not even cross more than about 200 grams, right? But in terms of its value, right? In terms of its value, it will be much more expensive, right? So that is when we do not calculate it on the basis of weight. We do not fix a rate on the basis like how we do it for a specific duty, saying that this is going to be the rate for 200 grams of this particular commodity. But rather, it is going to be calculated on the basis of the value. So a diamond or any precious jewelry or gem or gold, for that matter, will fall into this category, which will be where a tax is based on the value of the good. Compound duty is where it's a combination. So where commodities are taxed on the basis of their weight, which is where the specific duty will apply, and also on the basis of ad valorem or on the basis of value, where a combination of based on the value of the good, the rate on the basis of the value of a good could be imposed. So that's a compound, which is a combination of a specific duty as well as an ad valorem duty could be imposed. Right. So coming into non-tariff barriers, so those were taxes, so custom duties that are levied on imported as well as exported goods. So there are also pretty other different ways by which the government tries to use its controls to restrict imports into the country. So these are non-tax restrictions, as I told you, which could be in the form of government regulation and policies. Government makes certain rules and regulations that become so very stringent, so very long, and so very difficult and detailed for any import to take place. So that itself is a big put off. So obviously, that could discourage countries from not importing, or companies within the country and customers within the country from not importing. So it could be on the basis of that. So there are many ways like quotas, subsidies, and embargoes, and so on. So let's look at all of these a little more in detail. Quotas, as we understand, is nothing but a quantity restriction. So it is a numerical limit on the quantity of goods that can be imported or exported during a particular period. So which means a government could issue a specific quota and say, okay, if you want to import, you're allowed only to import 40% of this particular commodity. Only 40% is what you can import in 1 year. So if a company has a 100% requirement, so 40% is what is allowed for importing. So the remaining 60%, the company will have to source it locally or buy it locally. So that is where they enforce a quantity restriction, whereby quotas are imposed. So once you reach that particular limit, so you are I mean, that's when your limit stops and you cannot import any further. So there is a fixed restriction that is imposed during a particular period. So once you reach that limit, you will not be able to import any further. And anything more than that that you go to import, you will have to pay a higher charge, or you will have to pay a higher duty. And those will come into question as such. So the next thing that we have is called a voluntary export restraint. It is called a VER. So this is a quota on exports that can go out of the country. So just like how we have quotas with with specific limits about what can come into the country, we also have a specific limit of what you can export out of the country. And as I told you in the earlier example, that when you look at the supply and demand equation, if demand for a certain commodity is much higher, let's say for example, a couple of months ago we had issues with onion, right? Onions, the price of onions really skyrocketed, and it was really really difficult. So that's a typical case of of demand being greater than supply. So demand for onions being higher than the supply of onions. So which means there was a very short, stock of onions, and hence the prices really shot up in the domestic market. So if in this particular case, if a particular onion trading company or agency decides to export onions to a foreign country when it is badly needed by consumers within the country, so in that case, what can happen, right? So in that case, the government steps up and then it imposes a voluntary export restriction. So, and if the onion trader has an argument, say, I've always been exporting to this particular country, and now because of this changed scenario, so I'm unable to do that. So I have commitments that I have to keep with the foreign company. So in that particular case, the government can come up with an alternative of a VER and can say, okay, you can export only up to 25% of your quantity and stock, and the remaining will have to be made available for the local market for local consumption. That's what we call as a voluntary export restraint. Third is subsidies. It is a payment made by the government to the domestic producer so that they can compete against foreign goods. So, in order to ensure that we discourage imports and encourage exports, so if any export manufacturing firm or any firm that has the capability to export, so government has its export promotion measures by which it can offer a lot of subsidies to these companies that have the capacity to manufacture goods and export. So when there are more exports that go out of the country, obviously, it's going to give the government a lot of revenue in terms of its foreign exchange. So it can be a cash grant, or the government can give a subsidized input price, or it can give a tax holiday for any company that is exporting to foreign countries. So it can give them a tax holiday for about 10 years, saying that you don't have to pay taxes on this. So a lot of help and support could be given. You could be given a plot to manufacture in a special economic zone or in a export promotion zone, and so on. So through all these different measures, that's where the government tries to encourage more and more industries and businesses to get into the export activity, so that the country's exports will exceed the volume of imports in the long run. So what are the other barriers that we have? Yeah, the government imposes another barrier called administrative dealings. So these are regulatory controls and bureaucratic rules and red tape that makes it very difficult for any good to be imported. So you have to go from office to office, or you've got to run from pillar to post to get your clearances and show a lot of documentation and duplicates and triplicates, and get a permission, get licenses, get an NOC. So government imposes these administrative restrictions very deliberately to make the import activity a lot more long winding. So if a particular if a particular company or a customer would want to import, then they'll have to go through the rigmarole of all these long winding procedures. So that itself would become a very big put off, or would discourage companies from importing. So that's how the government will take care of one aspect of it. So we have something called LCR, which is called a local content requirement. So it is a legal regulation which states that a specific amount of commodity must be supplied in the domestic market by the producer. It is used to help local labor and domestic suppliers of goods. For example, if there is any commodity that needs to be manufactured within the country, uh, the government will have to, I mean, the company will have to use a certain quantity of local products, or local resources, or local employment, and so on. So that is what is called as an LCR. Only then the government will permit these companies to take up. Just like how we have a voluntary export restraint, where there is a certain restriction on the quantity of goods that can come into the country. Likewise, when you manufacture goods for exports, you will have to ensure that your goods that are going to be manufactured for exports will have to be locally sourced. So that gives ensures that the local business, local resources, and local employees will find employment in these jobs. So that is what was called is called as the local content requirement. So let me give you an example. One of the restrictions that we have in foreign direct investment is in multi-brand retailing. In multi-brand retailing, the government is allowed 51% uh, of FDI in multi-brand retailing. But along with that, they have also included a clause called a local content requirement, which means any good that is going to be manufactured by a foreign manufacturer or a foreign retailer, 30% of it will have to be supplied through a local company or a local industry. So that is where the LCR comes in. So whereby the government gives the benefit to the foreign company, but also imposes the LCR on the foreign company to ensure that local resources, local people, and local content will be considered in their business activity. The next way by which the government can impose a barrier is through currency control. So government could come up with restrictions on currency convertibility, making it very difficult for a company to convert its local currency into a foreign currency if it has to deal with importers of a foreign country and also pay them in their own respective currency. So that's where the government can impose uh, uh, local currency convertibility and also impose a restriction as to what's the volume or quantity of currency that could be exchanged. So that makes it a lot more difficult. Or it could say that only those who obtain certain licenses will be eligible or could go ahead with currency convertibility, thereby permitting it only to a restricted few and not allowing it to rest of the others. So that's another way by which the government could create a barrier and then ensure it is able to have a control over the import and the export activity within the country. Okay, so that pretty much sums up our explanation. So these are the most important tariff and non-tariff barriers that we have, and these are very important when it comes to international business. So as I told you in the introduction itself, that no import and export activity can take place. Now, what we need to understand is that the imposition of tariff and non-tariff barriers are not generalized, or it's not applied widely across goods and services. So this is where we take the case of the demand and the supply into equation, domestic demand and domestic supply into equation. We look at our export conditions, we look at our import conditions, and then what's available as such. And accordingly, we also need to keep in mind our balance of payment position and thereby ensure that we are able to take very appropriate decisions that balances the right kind of imports coming into the country and also ensures that there is enough support and assistance that is given to local companies so that they are able to sustain and manage things and also encourage these companies to also get into exports so that they can uh, help themselves with higher revenues and also help the country to manage its balance of payment position and equations as such. So that's where the government very carefully and very judiciously decides what kind of industries, what kind of commodities, and what kind of goods needs to be taxed higher and what goods needs to be taxed lower and which are the goods that needs to be tax free or tariff free. So all of these are decisions that the government will take, keeping the interest of its people and its own interest in the larger interest of the balance of payment and other macro environmental variables as such. So thank you.